Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is li-chun. On behalf of myself and my global team members based throughout Hong Kong, Taipei, and London, we would like to welcome you for this very special online talk. Now, we'd love to hear from you all. Please do feel free to drop us a message in the chat box to let us know where you're joining us from. My team had updated me that we have friends from various time zones. So no matter if you're waking up early, staying up late, or sparing your meal times for us, thank you all for your warm presence. And please allow me to express our gratitude towards our education partner, SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and our media partner, Wall Street Journal. We are delighted to present the third webinar of the World Musea Forum. The series of online presentations features museums around the world that will bring their unique vantage point to areas of collection management, education, conservation and restoration, technology, public engagement, and development. Today, we are presenting the Benaki Museum with three amazing scholars as our speakers: Dr. George Manginis, the academic director of the Benaki Museum in Athens; Dr. Armand Leroy, professor of evolutionary developmental biology at Imperial College London; and Dr. Melanie Gibson, art series senior editor at Ginkgo Library. They're going to take us to a new realm of researching art history by using Iznik ceramics as examples and artificial intelligence as means to decode the ornamental language. They will show us how computer trained by art historians can be used to identify, classify, or even date ceramics by styles. One last thing before we begin, please type in any questions you have in the chat box along the way, and we will go through them together. Or use the raise hand function during the Q&A session to interact with our speakers after the presentation. Now, without further ado, let's hand over to Armand, George, and Melanie. Thank you.
Thank you, li-chun. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all. Our story begins on a warm evening in central Athens in summer 2017. I found myself at a delightfully chaotic cocktail party at a friend's house. Most people spoke Greek, so I approached the only guest who looked foreign, and we started a conversation which continues. He was Armand Leroy, professor of evolutionary developmental biology at Imperial College, London. Although our professional fields are conventionally quite far apart, we found ourselves talking about research, specifically his own research on ways in which he could use artificial intelligence, AI, on the visual arts. He had already employed AI on music and had achieved remarkable results. But would material culture be an equally fruitful field? Next slide, please. Some of Armand's ideas discussed that evening included, next slide, the application of face recognition software on late antique funeral portraits from Egypt, the so-called Fayum portraits, the analysis of scenes on archaic and classical Greek vases, and the analysis of elements in still life paintings from the Dutch Golden Age, the 17th century, always using machine learning. I was entranced. This approach could allow checking the connection or lack of connection between art historical genealogies, the narratives that art historians create, and the understanding gained by the AI machines through training on and accessing original visual material. However, the groups of objects that we discussed that evening presented problems familiar to art historians and frustrating to scientists. beyond the very of photographic reproductions, which were necessary for the learning machines, the sample of Fayum portraits was relatively small, a few hundred at most, and subject to art historical controversy. The curved surfaces of Greek vases distorted the scenes and gave far too wide a variety of themes. And Dutch still lifes featured a wide range of iconographic elements, sometimes impossible to identify with any certainty. Incidentally, since then, Ornament has focused on Greek vase shapes, and has returned to Dutch still lifes with renewed confidence. So what we needed for our first AI excursion into the visual arts was a well-published, well-photographed body of material in good state of preservation, well-researched, securely dated, and with a limited palette of colors and a defined range of motifs on flat shapes. Next slide, please. The glazed and brightly colored ceramics produced between the late 15th and the 17th century at the town of Iznik in the Ottoman Empire fitted the bill. To this end, Dr. Melanie Gibson, a dear friend and longtime colleague in teaching and publishing on Islamic art and especially ceramics, joined the team to offer valuable expertise. Next slide, please. The three of us met in Greece a couple of times and discussed over emails and teleconferences our project. Students from the Royal College of Art and Imperial College embarked upon collecting high-quality digitized images of Iznik ceramics from museum collections around the world, and they designed customized AI tools to access the material under Armand's direction. I shall now call Professor Armand Leroy to explain more on the method and results of this team effort.
Thank you, George. Next slide, please. And next slide. And next slide. How a scientist studies art. So, as George says, I'm not an art historian, I'm an evolutionary biologist. But I'd long been quite interested in art, and one of the books that had fascinated me most was a classic that many of you will know, which is Owen Jones's 1856, The Grammar of Ornament. Now, actually, the book isn't that informative, but what I loved about it was the concept that ornament has a grammar, which implies that ornament has a language, or rather it's many languages, which is all these different ornamental traditions that we see around the world and at different times and places, and that ultimately go back 10,000 years or so. And it seemed to me that what we wanted to do was to use that metaphor, or that metaphor could be used for the way in which art historians understand ornament and study it, and that was the starting point for how a scientist and a computer scientist should approach it. Next slide, please. The thing that ornament special, different from ornamental art special, different from other kinds of art, is that it is primarily composed of motifs. That is to say, repeated decorative units, which are used again and again and again on any given artifact, such as a given plate or a given tile, and repeated across artifacts in different plates and different tiles. And this image shows you what I mean. So each of these things has tulips, and you can see that these tulips vary in their size and shape among these different things. So these motifs, it seemed to me, constitute the vocabulary, the lexicon of Iznik ornament, and our job was to actually identify them. All right, next slide, please. What do art historians do when confronted with ornament? I think that they do something like this, and that this is what we should be trying to do. The first is that they have to consider thousands of artifacts. That's the thing about ornament. It's not about one unique painting. It's about many, many, many artifacts, and these days spread in museums around the world. And that's certainly true for Iznik, to which we can add the fact that Istanbul is full of buildings, Ottoman buildings, which are just covered with Iznik tiles. So there's thousands of these things that we have to consider. That in itself makes an art historian's job quite difficult. The second thing that they have to do is that they have to identify the ornamental objects. They actually have to pick out those individual things that are on those plates or tiles or whatever. For instance, actually identify those particular tulips. Then they have to classify them into motifs, and then having identified that language, that vocabulary, use that in order to identify the artifacts themselves, to classify them by date or workshop or region or whatever. That, it seemed to me, is roughly what we should be trying to do and what art historians do. And that's what I want to tell you about now. Next slide, please. The difficulty of finding a vocabulary of ornament is illustrated here. So we have here, I've cut out a whole bunch of tulips from a whole bunch of different tiles and plates and so forth. And you can see that these tulips all bear some family relationship to each other, and that there are subfamilies of them. At the top, I've got striped, white and red striped ones. But you can see that they are kind of similar, and yet each of them is rather different. How should we divide these tulips into different motifs, into different words, so that we can use them to classify the artifacts that bear them? You can see that it's a very difficult job, and that any two given art historians, or any two people looking at this collection of tulips, might actually classify them in very different ways. We thought there's got to be a rational way of doing this, a scientific way of doing it. Next slide, please. And then there's a more fundamental difficulty, is that it actually takes a bit of a trained eye to pick out these things on the artifacts themselves. This is a tile. It's just a randomly chosen Iznik tile. And there are some tulips on them. Now, how many tulips and how many different kinds of tulips are there? I'm just going to let you just look at that for 5 seconds and see if you can pick them out. Okay. Next slide, please. Here's the answer. There are 6 tulips on there. There's a tulip on the top right, concealed behind a flower. There's then a blue tulip somewhere in the middle, which is partially concealed by 2 carnations. And then there's 4 tulips at the bottom. How many different kinds of tulips? Well, that's a little bit a matter of taste, right? There's clearly a big red tulip up there, and there's a big blue tulip. They are clearly different. And then we've got these 4 tulips down at the bottom. They seem to be maybe 2 different types. So maybe we would say that there are 4 different kinds of tulips, but you know, it's a pretty subjective thing. Well, all this kind of problem, this classification problem, is a very familiar one to a natural scientist. It's what we deal with, especially as evolutionary biologists. When we consider the diversity of natural objects, we are always trying to classify things, and we've got a wealth of tools that enable us to do so, statistical tools. And yet it seemed to me that these could be applied to art. Next slide, please. And where we began was with the problem of actually identifying, finding these individual objects. And to do that, we used something called a deep convolutional neural network. And while that's a very fancy name, and I'm not going to try to explain how that actually works, but suffice it to say, it's the kind of algorithm that underlies nearly all image analysis, or indeed most so-called artificial intelligence processing these days. It's the sort of thing that is used for facial recognition and, well, Google image searches and whatnot. And the idea is relatively simple. A convolutional neural network is an algorithm that in itself doesn't know much, but you can train it to learn what things are, to recognize things. And that's exactly what we did. We took several hundred images of Iznik objects, right? Iznik artifacts, tiles and plates and so on. And we identified the tulips in them. And we fed these things to the DCNN so that it learned what a tulip looks like. It had a mental representation, as it were, of what a tulip looks like. And that's tulips in all their diversity. And if it works, then if you give it a new plate or a new tile, it should be able just to pick those tulips out. It'll be able to identify them and say, that's a tulip down there. But of course, it doesn't have to be just tulips. You can do this with anything. Next slide, please. You can do it with carnations, for example. Next slide, please. And in fact, because we were just testing this technology, we were trying to, this is a demonstration, a map of what we want to do in the future. We chose just 3 kinds of motifs: tulips, carnations, and these things which are saz leaves, a very special kind of Iznik motif that is ultimately derived from the Persian. Melanie can tell you much more about it, but it's a very characteristic and very famous aspect of Iznik. Next slide, please. All right, so the question is, could we actually get a computer to identify these things and distinguish them? And the answer is, yeah, we could pretty well. It took quite a lot of work, a lot of tweaking with the algorithm, a lot of basic identifying tulips on plates to teach the thing, but we were able to. And this illustrates it. So if you look on the left, you'll see a plate, a picture of a plate, and there are 4 tulips on there. And the image directly below that, and we see the gray outline of tulips. That's where the tulips actually are. And directly below that, you'll see four more tulips, now in blue. Those are the tulips. Those are the regions of the plate that the computer predicts tulips actually are present. And you can see that it did a pretty good job of doing so. And the rest of the figure shows all the different kinds of tulips in outline, and carnations and saz leaves. And it just gives you a sense of the diversity of them that there are out there, that the computer was able to recognize. So it's got a very complicated and sophisticated model of what a tulip or a carnation or a saz leaf looks like in its head. And we found that we could generally get between 75 and 77% accurate recognition on these things. Saz leaves were a little bit more difficult. It tended to confuse saz leaves with other kinds of leaves, but that may be because saz leaves maybe aren't quite as distinct as art historians sometimes say they are. Next slide, please. All right, so now we've got a computer to identify these things, just to pick them out. And now what we want to do is we want to classify these things into motifs. And as I said, that's quite a difficult thing to do. It's quite a subjective thing, but we wanted an objective way of doing it, a statistical way of doing it. All right, so there are 3 basic kinds of features that these things have. There's their color, there's their shape, and then there's their size. And that's what we wanted to do, is take that information together and build a statistical lexicon. Next slide, please. So the difficult part turned out actually to be to identify the colors. Art historians have studied the colors of Iznik in great depth, and they speak about them a lot. And they argue very cogently that there is a palette, a very distinctive palette that the Iznik artisans used, and one, moreover, that changed over time. So, for instance, they began using blues, and later on, for instance, they introduced a very particular kind of red. And they will write and speak about these colors as if they really objectively exist, and I don't doubt that they actually do. But of course, it's quite difficult to go from an art historian's description of a color, say sage green, to actually knowing on any given image what is a sage green, because the actual RGB values, the color values of any given pixel, well, it doesn't come there labeled as sage green. There's just a whole range of colors, and we found it actually pretty difficult to identify the palette. The solution we came is to actually begin with an art historian. So I fished out a whole bunch of these Iznik things, about 24 of them, and I gave them to Melanie, and I said, Melanie, as an art historian, tell me what colors are in these images. And she had to look through them, as it were, and see past the variation in that was intrinsic to these images. Bear in mind, they come from museum websites from around the world, so they're all under uncontrolled photographic circumstances, right? So she looks through this variation and she says, oh, that's a sage green, that's a blue, that's a red over there. And taking that information, we then fed it to another machine learning algorithm. There's a whole bunch of these machine learning algorithms that we use with different flavors, but we don't have to go into the details. And having taught the computer what a sage green or a deep red was, we then fed it all the other Iznik images and we said, tell us what colors are there. And we basically were able to use a palette of 8 colors, which is pretty close to, well, what most scholars would argue is a canonical palette, though Melanie's going to be telling you more about that. And then and that told us then what the colors of these things were. Okay, next slide, please. And then we had to analyze their shape. Now, it turns out that shape analysis is a very complicated mathematical field. And again, I won't go into the details, but suffice to say, this is the sort of thing which you can do. So you can take the shapes of a whole bunch of objects. These could be any objects, but again, they happen to be tulips, and we can describe them mathematically, and we can ordinate them on a plot like this. On the right there, you can see that we've got very simple sort of elongate tulips. These are the little tulips that the Iznik guys painted. And then on the right, we've got the much bigger, fatter, more complex tulips. But they're all tulips, and we can then describe them in this mathematical space. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we can describe their shape, right? They vary by several orders of magnitude in size. And next slide, please. And then we take all this data. We have now described our tulips in terms of their colors, in terms of their shape, in terms of their size, their relative size, and this is all now several hundred variables, several hundred numbers which describe any given tulip. And we take all that and we feed it to yet another kind of algorithm, a clustering algorithm, and we say, how many different kinds of tulips are there? And the answer is this 19. And 3 types of carnations and 24 types of sazli. And this then is the lexicon, the vocabulary of Iznik art as seen in our collection of images, of artifacts. Now, let me be clear. This is not some absolute model. This is not some absolute statement about what the vocabulary is. It's a model, a statistical model of that, of it. And if we had more data, for instance, if we had all the slides, or if we had images of all the tiles in Istanbul, we'd certainly find that there would be more kinds of tulips out there. Or more subtly, if we used different algorithms and different parameter settings, we'd come up with a somewhat different answer. But it probably wouldn't be a very different answer. And the question is, but there's no absolute one correct answer to this. Rather, we sort of converge upon what we think the vocabulary would be. The question is it of any use, right? It's one thing to describe the vocabulary of Iznik art. We want to actually do something with that. And what we want to do is tell us something about the artifacts that actually bear them. Next slide, please. Art historians have classified Iznik artifacts in a whole variety of ways. But what they've especially managed to do with some confidence is date them. And they date them in part on the basis of their motifs, but also on the shapes and the more subtle forms of these things. I asked Melanie to date a bunch of these things, several hundred of these things in our collection of images. And we found that most of them fell into 2 groups, from the mid-16th century, 1520 to 1560, and in the late 16th century, 1561 to 1600. And she used all her art historical nous in order to date these things. And then what we did is we took those dates and we took the information, the class of the lexicon, the ornamental lexicon that we had already derived, mapped them onto those objects and fed them to yet another machine learning algorithm. And we said, given that we have now taught this algorithm on the basis of art historical expertise, what a mid-16th century Iznik object looks like and what a late 16th century artifact looks like, can we actually learn the difference between them? And the answer is we could. We can now classify any given Iznik object, artifact, with about an 80% accuracy. So let's be clear what we've done here. What this means is that if you, a curator in a museum somewhere, has got some Iznik artifacts in your collection, in principle, if you send me a picture of that artifact, I should be able to run it through this whole processing chain, quite a complicated one, it has to be said, but it's all automated. And I should be able to give you, with some accuracy, a date out the other end, at least if it falls into one of these two groups, which covers quite a lot of Iznik. What that means is that we have, in effect, taken art historical expertise and built a computer model out of it. We have built, I don't know, you could call it a computational connoisseur. I want you to know this isn't replacing the art historian, rather it is allowing art historians to work at any scale they please, to study thousands of things instead of just individually. And that is, I think, where the value of this comes in. But let me hand over to Melanie now, who's going to give an art historian's perspective on this project.
Thank you, Armand. Next slide, please. So as George mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, sorry, can you just go back for a second to the first one, literally about how an art historian copes, because that's what I'm going to talk about. So George introduced me to Armand at the Benaki Museum. It was in fact at the opening of China Rediscovered, an exhibition of the Benaki Chinese ceramic collection. And Armand asked me if I would be interested in taking part in the project as an advisor. And I agreed. I was intrigued by the project he was outlining, but I was also a little anxious that my knowledge of Ottoman ceramics, acquired over many years, might somehow be outclassed by artificial intelligence. So now the next slide, please. The team had amassed hundreds of images of objects, mostly large plates and tiles, because it's their flat surfaces that are the easiest to read. And my first task was to sift through them to identify any that did not qualify as Iznik. Now, this is essential because museum databases can sometimes be rather misleading, but more significantly, a group of Ottoman designers and craftsmen were active in Damascus in the second half of the 16th century, and they were producing objects very similar in style to those that were being produced in Iznik, but with a slightly modified palette. So the tile that you see on the left in this slide is the one that I removed from the project because, as you can see, it includes 6 tulips on the left and the right, 3 on each side, and also 2 carnations at the bottom. But its palette and this rather specific design identified as having been made in Damascus. Next slide, please. The next step was to consider the shapes that had been chosen. As Armand said, these were just 3 out of very many. But I wanted also to give you the art historical context of these particular motifs. So on this tile on the right has 2 central saz leaves. This is a very specific serrated leaf, although other leaves can be confused with it. But I think it has a long, thin shape with a serrated edge. And it was introduced in the 1520s by Shah Kulu, the head designer of the Ottoman court, a man who was trained in the Persian tradition and whose designs were passed to all the palace workshops, including those making pottery. Tulips and carnations, on the other hand, as well as hyacinths, roses and prunus blossoms, form part of a more realistic style that is associated with illustrated books of natural history that were reaching the Ottoman court around the middle of the 16th century, probably as gifts. And their introduction is closely associated with Shah Kulu's student and successor, as the Nakashbashi, or the head of the design atelier, and he was the artist Karamemi. Next, please. So Armand has already spoken a little bit about colors, but I thought I would give it to you from my point of view. He asked me to make a list of canonical colors. And my initial assessment, which you can see in the left-hand column at the top, identified 20 different colors with various shades of blue, of green, of purple, and of red. And subsequently, I went through a process of elimination, or rather Armand went through a process of elimination. And this was very much the computer teaching me, because as an art historian, I'm accustomed to looking at all the different shades and to assessing them as different shades. But what in fact was happening was that I was looking at different shades which were made with the same pigment, but were applied at different thicknesses. So the computer found it difficult to, the black outlines were too insubstantial, so that was one color that was dropped. And the various shades of blue, green, red, and purple could in each case be distilled down to one color. Since, as I said, my eye was identifying were the different shades achieved by the different thicknesses of application. So if you think about the pale lilac and the dark purple, which you can see in the two central dishes in the top row, these were in fact a single color achieved with a single mineral component, which is manganese, but applied with different thicknesses. And the next slide, please. And after we'd gone through this reduction, this sort of distillation process, we ended up with 8 different colors, including the background. And each object in the study was then given a canonical plot. And this is what you see on the screen now, mapping out the precise range of colors that are included on it. Next slide, please. Now, my years of looking at Iznik pieces have given me the ability to make a fairly swift assessment of an object's date, entirely based on its combination of motifs and colors. As Armand mentioned, the ceramics were divided into 2 approximate date bands of 40 years. The first starting in 1520 and going up to 1560, and the second running from 1561 to 1600. The sequencing ignored the earliest date range, which some of you who know about Iznik ceramics know actually went from 1480 to 1520. So if you look at the dish on the far left in the top band, that falls into this category. And the dishes and objects in this period do not include the saz leaf, the tulip, or the carnation, and that was the reason for dropping them. The designs on this group were instead inspired from silver and also from Chinese porcelains, although perhaps not even directly from Chinese porcelains themselves, but from copies of them produced in Iran and Syria. Now, the 3 tiles to the right of that dish from the early group are all associated with dated buildings. And the 2 mosque lamps on the far right, so the first one is one that was made for the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and is datable to the period from 1545 to 1552. And the second one with the red color is from the Suleymaniye and also can therefore be dated to a 7-year date range of 1550 to 1557 when the Suleymaniye was being built. Now, by extending this study to the tiles, the many, many tiles in dated buildings in Istanbul and Edirne also, and this hopefully will be the next stage of this project, we'll be able to refine the dating of the artificial intelligence. It has so far made assessments within a 40-year bound, but in the future, this will be much more specific and therefore more accurate. Thank you. Over to you, Armand.
Perfect. The Iznik is fascinating because it sits at the center of several great ornamental traditions that stretch both forward in time and backward in time. It's been immensely influential. And I can't shout out all the ways in which it has been, but suffice it to say, wherever you see floral motifs is subsequent to the Ottomans in Europe, chances are you've got some influence of Iznik there. Take a look, for instance, at this one. This is a Greek plate made by the Icaro company in Rhodos, and Yanis Ioannidis had a wonderful exhibition at the Benaki about this just a few years ago. And these are frank copies, very close imitations, very much directly inspired by Iznik. And when I say they're imitations, I don't mean to denigrate them. They are beautiful and very collectible objects in their own right. But here we see the direct influence of Iznik upon a later decorative tradition. And it goes far beyond it. Next slide, please. Melanie has written a wonderful article showing how Iznik, or Persian motifs as they're sometimes called, filter through into the English art tradition of the 1900s and somewhat earlier. People like William Morris adopted these techniques and these motifs. This is a plate. This is a tile made by a company called Pilkington in the United Kingdom, somewhere between 1900 and 1910. And the particular fascination of this is that is seen in the photograph of the right. It's an exceedingly blurry and rather poor photograph, but that's because it was taken deep under the sea, under the North Atlantic. It is in fact a picture of the wall of the hammam of RMS Titanic that was taken by James Cameron. There are Iznik-derived ornamental tiles at the bottom of the Atlantic. They're everywhere. Next slide, please. But the thing that really fascinates me about Iznik is not even that it's just Iznik per se. These techniques that we've developed can be applied to any kind of ornamental tradition. And behind Iznik stands the Everest of ornament, China. So Iznik began as frank imitations of Ming porcelain. On the left, we have a Yongle porcelain charger, dates from 1425. The Ottomans collected these things like mad. The Topkapi Museum is full of them. It's got one of the great collections of Chinese porcelain. And the Ottomans loved them so much that they basically said to their own artisans, make copies of them. But of course, they didn't know how to make porcelain, so they made them in footwear. And they started off by making exact copies. But I don't want to just focus upon Iznik, because this tells us that there is this immense ornamental tradition in China, and we can do what we've been doing here for all of that. We can filter this all through, we can use the same techniques and chart the history of ornament in a quantitative way at a scale that has simply not been possible before, that art historians have not been able to do, that would take an army of art historians to do. But I think we can now do that using artificial intelligence. And the fundamental reason is, next slide, please. There are so many other things that we can do. I wanted to show you that we don't have to just study ornament, we can study shape. This is a slide showing the evolution of some Korean celadon vessels, a certain kind of wine vessel. And this is actually taken from a dissertation at SOAS by our very own moderator, li-chun. And it's wonderful. And I wish I had known at the time that she was doing this, because I want to just show you something that we've been doing. Next slide, please. We've also been studying the evolution of shape. And here, we've been studying them in ancient Greek vases. And this is a particular little fat kind of amphora called a peliki. And we've downloaded something like 40,000 images of Greek vases from an archive called the Beazley Archive at Oxford. And we've been extracting the shapes. And can you run the little animation? There you have it. There's 1,750 profiles of ancient Greek vases in 15 seconds. That's exactly what li-chun was doing, but we're doing it computationally and statistically. And the reason that we can do this, and the reason that we can use all these techniques is, next slide, please, is simply because the data are now available. All the great museums in the world containing all those millions of objects are putting their catalogs online with images. So it's just a matter of downloading them and applying the right kind of AI tools, image recognition tools to them, ones that are suited for any particular task, be it shape analysis or recognition of objects or ornament or whatever. And what we're doing then, in effect, is studying art history at an enormous scale. And to do that, we have to convert the art into numbers, and that implies statistics. And if you're doing that, then basically you're doing science. So I think that what is going to happen is that art history is going to become a science that looks very much like any other kind of natural science, or evolutionary biology, for example, with many of the same kinds of tools and arguments. But you shouldn't think that this is an art history without art, a science of art without art historians. As our project illustrates, what we need really is we need art historians to tell us what actually happened and what are the important things that are going on in any given body of work, any given tradition. We need curators to give us access to all this data. We need computer scientists to develop the algorithms to read it. And then we need natural scientists such as myself to work with all this information and use it to actually test hypotheses about how art evolves. And that roughly is what I think is how I think art history is going to go over the next decade or so. But let me hand over to George for some final words on and thoughts about this.
Thank you, Armand. Well, as both Melanie and Armand mentioned, the natural next step in our Iznik project will be to include large assemblages of Iznik tiles in Istanbul mosques and mausolea, like the one in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. These panels, sometimes consisting of hundreds of individual tiles, are ideal material due to their size and extensive historical documentation. And to this end, colleagues in Turkey are invited to join us. However, as collaborators in the project have outlined, what we hope to learn is not limited to a novel understanding of Iznik. AI learning can exponentially increase the volume of material that can be processed in the study of visual culture. I can imagine some people in the audience thinking, why do we need this to be done by machines? And as an art historian and archaeologist, I have to answer that as well. They will go, aren't art historians already a seriously underemployed rarity in academia, able to gain a comparable understanding of tulips, carnations, and saz leaves? Why should they, for the sake of the game, forsake their connoisseurial privilege for a machine's clumsy objectivity? Will Armand convert us all into computational connoisseurs? Well, I would argue that art historians shouldn't forsake their connoisseurial privilege. They should just go beyond it. Although a conventional understanding of particular groups of material is possible, it often takes a few specialists in each generation an entire time to achieve deep familiarity with each group. However, there are groups of material that are much more populous than Iznik tiles, Dutch still lifes, or Greek vases. For example, medieval and Renaissance silks from Italian cities, either surviving or depicted in paintings. There are so many of those. Marginal illuminations in medieval manuscripts, or the decorative bands applied on Chinese porcelains, millions. And then, why not break up these art historically constituted categories and go beyond the boundaries we ourselves have set up? Why not bring in Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Thai, Indian, and Iranian ceramics alongside Chinese equivalents? And why should material be a limitation? In recent decades, the most fascinating studies have been those that broke up the pigeonholing dictated by the traditional hierarchical readings of material culture. I would not argue that we should take the researcher's subjectivity out of the art historical discourse. However, I would welcome rigorous an approach as possible to our chosen focus and as wide a sample on which questions can be asked. This interdisciplinary project between computer and natural scientists and art historians goes at the heart of all disciplines. The art history becomes more than a sample and the science more than a utility. Next slide, please. This project began as a meeting of 3 scholars, and I would like to share here our favorite group photograph taken at the Greek home of British author Patrick Leigh Fermat, now a branch of the Benaki Museum in southern Greece, in Kardamili. However, it has grown thanks to enthusiastic students and colleagues, and this project can evolve into a wider one, with which we can delve into human perception and creativity. All good things start from small beginnings, but rarely as happy as a beginning like this. Thank you very much on behalf of all my fellow panelists.
Wow, thank you, Armand, George, and Melanie for such an informative and inspiring talk. And it seems like a door of a science to study art history has just been opened to us. And now we would like to introduce you very special guests, 2 of them, the Greek Consul General of Greece, Mr. Katoulas, and Consul General of Turkey, Ms. Kalyongju. We would like to invite them to speak some words with us, please. Consul General of Greece, would you mind coming first?
I would like to thank very much you, Mrs. Li-chun, for introducing me here. I would like to thank Art Asia Hong Kong in the context of World Museum Forum 2021 for this organization of this to today's webinar. I'm just going to say a few words. I found very interesting the presentation made by the specialists just before. I would like to stress to mention a few things about Benaki Museum. Benaki Museum was established, is one of the most important landmark cultural institutions in Greece. It was founded in 1930 by Mr. Antonis Benakis in homage to his father, Emmanuel Benakis. The museum, I think that I would just like to mention some numbers so that it's obvious how important this institution is for Greece. At the moment, there's 7 museums, not only the central Benaki Museum, but 6 more satellite museums. The central museum is dedicated mostly to Greek culture throughout the centuries. There is 5 active archives, 7 conservation laboratories, 120,000 artworks from the Paleolithic to today's age, 30 temporary exhibitions, 450 cultural events organized just the year before. It's really a point of reference for Greek culture. In this vein, I would like to talk about the permanent exhibitions that the museum holds at the moment. There's a permanent exhibition which covers the period from ancient Greek and Roman art history to Islamic, to Byzantine art, to Chinese and Korean art, and to post-Byzantine and Neo-Hellenic art. The collection of Byzantine art showcases the continuity of Greek culture throughout the centuries, joining the ancient Greece with modern Greece. And of course, the fact that there are so many references of Islamic art and Chinese and Korean art showcases the bridges that culture can build to really bring together all peoples from all different continents. At the moment, there are two temporary exhibitions as well. The one is from Mr. Yannis Psychopedis, and it's named about heroes of 1821. I would like to mention now that 2021 is 200 years from the Greek Revolution and the foundation of the modern Greek state. And the other very important exhibition is the exhibition 1821 Before and After, which is under the patronage of Her Excellency, the President of the Hellenic Republic, Mrs. Katerina Sakelaropoulou, and it's included in the National Program of Bicentennial Celebrations coordinated by the Greece 2021 Committee. Those are the things I would like to say. Thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Consul General of Greece, for your kind words and your support. And now, can we please have the Consul General of Turkey to have some words with us, please?
Thank you very much, li-chun. Thank you very much for inviting us to this very informative event. I have the privilege to first witness this how technology has been used to gather a precise information, which is very relevant for the art history. And I have learned that art historians, with the implementation of this technology, now we are speaking about science. I mean, we are in a new generation of information age. And this is, in my opinion, very relevant. And it was a quite privilege for me that the basis of this study, the Iznik tiles have been used to support this very academically relevant study. And also you gave me a good opportunity to say hi to Kostas, to my Greek Consul General colleague. He's one of my best friends and colleagues in Hong Kong. So it's also another good opportunity to say hi to a good friend. I congratulate wholeheartedly all the academicians and for their very strong work, Mr. Manginis, Ms. Melanie, and Mr. Armand for their joint presentation. Actually, I have learned a lot, and I hope they find a good collaboration in Turkey to further their studies, to deepen this information. I mean, it has been already mentioned, but Istanbul mosques, palaces, Bursa, Iznik, these cities are like open air museum. I mean, any mosque, any historical mosque you enter in Istanbul, you will be amazed by the number of tiles, number of Iznik tiles that one can witness. So I hope through a good collaboration, this study can be even furthered and also can be translated into understanding other cultural ornaments, elements of other cultures as well. So I congratulate all of you. Please let me give some basics, since we have spoken a lot about Iznik. Iznik is a very unique city. Iznik is a city of history. Iznik was founded by the Greek Macedonian king Alexander the Great. So it is not any city in the world. It is a very significant city in the history of Christianity, where today's East, West Church, Orthodoxy, etc., this kind of phenomenal discussions was born in Nicaea, in Iznik. It is part of Bursa. Iznik was the first capital of Turks in Anatolia. So it changed hands a couple of times, but before Ottomans, Selçuk Empire made Iznik the capital. So Iznik is a very significant city in terms of history, in terms of art. And the art of Iznik tiles, Iznik ceramics is also, it doesn't just belong to Turks anymore, because it is part of UNESCO intangible cultural heritage. So this is humanity's common shared value, and that we will pass generations by generations. So I think giving this context, this study, this strong academic study, which brings technology and artificial intelligence, will help art historians to better classify, better understand, better present, and when all these antiques exchange hands, to better authenticate maybe. I mean, we are also in the age of authenticating art, authenticating antiquity. So again, thank you very much. I don't want to take much of your time. Some of the questions were relevant to tulip. I have to be very frank about it. I Google searched it. So why it is very important in Turkish culture. Of course, I know a lot, but there are many reasons for it. I mean, tulip flower was first found in Central Asia, brought to Anatolia by Turks. And it is, of course, first an ornamental, natural beauty. So, and the sultans of Ottomans, they brought it into palace. And in the Islamic culture, since you cannot depict human figures back then in those centuries, so tulip has become the main ornamental element. And one of the attendees already answered very well. When you write it in Arabic alphabets, it resonates the name of Allah, the God, the creator. And also, if you read it from right to the opposite side, it is the moon, the crescent. So I think due to its beauty, due to its presence, and due to its maybe esoteric or maybe some numerological significance, it has become one of the main elements of Turkish culture. And also we brought it to Europe, and it has also become economic value in Europe. So today was a very interesting day for me. I have learned a lot, and I was very happy to see that Iznik tiles, Turkish cultural elements were part of the study. I again thank you all and congratulate you. And as our consulate, if there is anything that we can further collaborate, we are always at your disposal. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you, Consul General. And I think I'm going to ask you, since you're so already offered, like it's a wish from all of us and then our speakers here. Can we please have the access to the Topkapi Museum database for research purposes? And
I mean, it is publicly accessible.
Please do help us. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. And yep, we have a lot of questions coming in. And regarding the significance of tulip and carnations in this culture, does Melanie, you have anything to add to this?
Thank you. Anything to add to this? I think the Consul General has answered the question very nicely for me, actually. And also, I'm giving a course of lectures at the moment at which one of my students was here, and she also answered the questions, because I was talking about this only yesterday afternoon, which is, as the Consul General said, the resonance of the word lale, which is the word for tulip, with Allah. That is one. But more to the point, I think also was that the passionate love of gardens. Ottoman palaces were completely full of gardens. They loved gardens, and we see them in many different manifestations. So it was the tulip, which came from, was grown all over Anatolia, wild, but it was also the carnation. It was also all the flowers which are harbingers of spring and of and that they liked being surrounded by. So I think the study can also go on to look at other motifs within the canon. It's not just the tulip is maybe the most, and carnation are most of the most visible ones, but there are plenty of others that could also be, the same technology could be applied to them, and they could be recognized in the same way.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. And I have a question here by Beatrice. She said, fascinating talk and very exciting to see the seminal stage of a great change in the ways art and art studies are approached. I wonder, what are your thoughts on forgeries? Is there any way for AI to be educated to spot them? Surely that would probably still require physical testing. Thank you very much. And would you guys like to take turns?
I think that's one for Armand. I'm going to pass it on to him.
Well, that's a very good question. So we're working entirely with images here. And I don't think that, well, if Turkey now has artisans who are making extraordinarily beautiful, faithful copies, reproductions of Iznik, of Iznik plates. You can go to Iznik and you can buy them there. And I do not believe for a minute that a highly skilled artisan a plate made by a highly skilled artisan, which is a faithful copy, can be in fact distinguished by AI just on the basis of the image alone. So that's absolutely true that you would need some sort of physical test. But let me just say that really you shouldn't think of AI as being tied to a particular kind of data. One could take the image data, and one could take physical data, chemical data, and one could incorporate that all together in an AI model to discriminate between fakes and or reproductions and old plates. So so the answer is on the basis of image, probably not. At least not if somebody set out to deceive. On the basis of a more comprehensive data set, yeah, I'm pretty sure you could, I think.
Okay, thank you, Armand. And I see two raised hands here. They would like to interact with you guys, and I will invite the first one, Qian Chen. Qian, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you
Yes.
perfectly.
Okay, great. Firstly, thank you for this informative and impressive talk and research, and thank you, Li-chun, for moderating this. So I have two questions. So the first one is actually also about forgery, but I want to take one step further. So I think you can show an example of a Greek imitation back in early 20th century, and also the Damascus imitation of the Iznik. And I want to mention that in far away in East Asia, like for example in Japan, in early 20th century, they also have a copy of Iznik, like for example the Imari, Japanese Iznik plate and dishes. But they are, even though they have really close imitation of the tulip and all the pattern and motif, but they do have very different composition and layout in general. So could the computer also deal with the composition and the layout of the design of the plate? So that is my first question. And this leading to the second one. So if the computer can deal with all of this, not only a motif, so beyond the motif, then can machine learning, this methodology, do the prediction of the certain kind of a plate or Iznik design. So for example, can we have all this data and then we produce, say, a 18th, 19th century or the 15th century Iznik tile or Iznik charter?
Right. So the first question is about the arrangement of motifs rather than the motifs themselves on any given ornamental object. And that is a fascinating question. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that, to use this linguistic analogy, if the motifs are themselves are the lexicon, the words of an ornamental language, it is precisely the way in which they are arranged that is the grammar. And I think that's what Owen Jones was actually getting at. So we haven't studied that in Iznik yet. That's sort of a separate thing, but there's no doubt we could, because what we would actually really like to do, one of the things I'd love to do next, is precisely to identify the regularities, the rules by which these motifs are assembled together in any given object. And there must be general rules to which the Iznik artisans use that we don't really actually fully understand. Art historians have spoken about this to some degree, but you could absolutely do that. So, but that remains an open question. The second part was, can we predict what was actually the question? The question was, can we predict the data?
Yeah, so can we, when we gathering all this data, can we reproduce an Iznik work so far by ourselves? So actually, this question came from one of my recent research and writing. Is about because just in recent 5 years, there were a lot of shard of Chinese porcelain was exported into East Africa. So the problem is a lot of East African Chinese porcelain were all broken, and they are really hard to put it all together. But we do have motif and some module, but we don't have an intact piece. So say if this machine learning method actually works, can we actually make and reproduce an intact piece? So
yeah,
that would be.
So there's a number of people who are working on that. They are taking it's a reasonable area of interest in which people are taking shards, 3D scanning them, and then attempting to assemble them or infer what the complete vessel looks like, where it came from. So you could absolutely build a model of that sort, and you can then make a prediction, a statistical prediction as to what it looks like and when it was made. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much.
Oh, Qian, would you mind telling our audience and the speakers like your background and where you're from, your organization, please?
Oh, okay. So my name is Qian Chen. I currently teaching at the University of Toronto history of art. But just back to I know Li-chun for years, and just back to my undergraduate and also my first master. I was working as a bioengineer. So I used to work at Beckman Institute in UIUC, and what I do was I use MATLAB to do a prediction model on cell migration. So we do have I set up a model to predict what the cell will move on the next step, and we use a fluorescence protein. And that's the time when we work with Chicago Art Institute, and then we produce on bio art.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, thank you, Qian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And can we please now have Claire Tang? Claire, would you mind? Hi. Thank you. And then please also tell us your organization and background for a bit. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Claire Tang from Paris. I'm a freelance or independent researcher of Chinese porcelain and Chinese art, and also a freelance animator. And I want to just thank everyone from this lecture. And it's such a magical lecture. It's full of inspiration because I was want to collaborate or work or understand more how AI or machine learning or deep learning can help art history or art in general to understand art in wider scale, like globally, in between cultures and connections. As an art historian, as a curator of Chinese porcelain, I'm always amazed by how the interactions between different cultures, especially between Chinese porcelain, Islamic, and European porcelain, how they interact with each other. But we normally only specialize in one area unless we speak mutually that we couldn't understand each other. And we could understand the background, historical background or trade or culture, but we can't figure out the truth behind it, the the true nature behind it. And it happened to be that my husband, he is a data scientist. So he worked for many industries, oil industry and cars. And I always want to work with him, ask him, so can you help me to just identify the pattern? And he always asked for me the code data or clean data. He said, if you can clean the data, I can help you. I can set up an easy model for you. But I don't understand what that data means. So after reading your paper, I know, because the data, like the color shades, because art historian, we focus on shades. This is pale green, this is dark green, but for the computer, it's just green. And the style. So your lecture today is just so magical because it shows the possibility that we can work with together and to find out the pattern. And the question so from me is goes to as a curator, so what's the suggestion for every one of you for future studies if we want to work with data science? So how do we collect data or image? Does that mean that we collect as many as impossible, or it's where do we start? That's one. And the other thing is I worked in past few years for special exhibitions, and due to this COVID thing, so it was canceled. And I want to know this approach, can we further develop into tools that can enable distant audience or visitors to use museum digital collections, like interact with museum collections without being present in the museum. So that's my second questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. These are both sort of museum-related questions, so I will take them. The science of photography and of photographic reproduction has moved a long way from the flat photography that we're used to. It is a question of programming and, of course, cost, but museums are increasingly moving towards total scanning of objects so that we can create 3D models of the objects in extremely high resolution, by which you can rotate the object as if you're holding it in your hand, and you can zoom in into details. Of course, all that hinges on the quality of light, the resolution of the cameras used, and so on and so forth. What you're in the end creating is a virtual image of an object. However, this is light years away from the black and white photograph most of us were trained on when we were students. So the way forward is to have as faithful 3D reproductions of objects. And this, again, the policy increasingly in museums across the world is to offer freely online, accessible to all. The problem, the biggest problem, honestly, will not be how much we have freely available, is how we access all the sea of data that will be freely available, and how we sort of go about and find what we need, and also the quality of metadata, as Melanie has highlighted. So very often classifying a Damascus, for example, tile as Iznik. And this, not the actual image, not the actual technology of the reproduction, but the metadata that will guide us, that will lead us into the object that we're interested in. Very often, this is the problem. But politically speaking, museums, in the sense museum policies, we tend to have more and more things as openly available as possible, and as well recorded photographically as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And I have another raised hand by Elena. Thank
Hi,
you.
yes, hi. So I'm Eline van den Berg from the Prinsessenhof National Museum of Ceramics in the Netherlands, and I've been really fascinated hearing you talk about it. And also, I was sent by Candice Lee the article, which also really excited me about these developments. Actually, our museum, together with the main museums in the Netherlands, is building a large database online to make sure all the Asian ceramics collections in the Netherlands will be available. So I think developments like this are extremely useful in that. And I think as a curator, this is really exciting because it can really complement our work. So I will keep following your work, of course. My question was actually related to the use of colors, and you've already been talking about that a bit, and also how it might be difficult in terms of different photos that have been made in different periods, which the pigment showed different colors. And then I was specifically referring to cobalt blue, because we know from the early Ming Dynasty porcelains, but also Joseon blue and white porcelains, that they were using cobalt from the Middle East. And later on, we're using more and more local sources. And do you think that future development will be able to tell the difference? Because there's such a debate going on that topic for years, and it will be so exciting to actually have a tool to recognize that.
Cool. So Armand will answer the question then.
I'll try. So the short answer is that it all depends upon the quality of the images, right? So we did this this project on the cheap. And by that I mean is we got a bunch of students and I myself, just to scrape, actually just download loads of images from the museums around the world, the V&A and the BM and the Benaki and the Met and so on and so on and so on. And so that means that our image quality was really very variable, which means that we really had to go through this whole song and dance in order to make a palette, right? And our palette is a relatively crude one. I mean, Melanie can make much more subtle discriminations. And in principle, our computer could do the same if the original images are highly standardized, if they come with color standards. For one thing, they don't all have to be taken under the same circumstances, but most of our images don't come even with color standards on them. So I would urge your Dutch project that if you're going to be photographing all these things, for God's sake, include color standards, because that will take us a very long way. And once you've done that, then if there's variation in the shades of blue of the cobalt that are visible to the naked eye, I have no doubt that we can build a statistical model that we could assign, give a probabilistic assignment of any given object to any given cobalt blue, shade of cobalt blue that you please. But it really does depend upon the quality of the original images. I should also say, and somebody else raised a question about this. Somebody asked about in the chat about different shades of red that were used at different times in the evolution of Iznik. And again, we could make those distinctions. But I think the real power of AI comes that it doesn't usually depend upon assigning a date or a place, classifying an object on the basis of any one criteria, such as just the shade of red or just the shade of blue. What it really does is it integrates a whole bunch of information, a whole bunch of variables, and then makes a collective decision on the basis of that, right? So I think that's where the real power of AI comes from, rather than making those individual discriminations. Does that help, Eline?
Yes, no, indeed. And for sure, the pictures will all be in color, I can assure you.
And have color standards.
Yeah, like high quality new photos. And so, yeah.
Good.
Okay, thank you, Elena. And I think we have Natalia. Natalia here would like to ask some questions too.
Hi there. I am just wondering, for the moment, your algorithm is pretty much using existing theories about when particular piece of Iznik was produced, and analyzes, you know, like a out of sample plate or a tile to roughly assign a date to it. And in a sense, you know, like the results are pretty predictable. And if we look on the a page, you will see a clear distinction between pre-introduction of red ball and post-introduction of red ball, which is a very much accepted, you know, like development of Iznik. My question relates to taking this a little bit further, and is there a possibility of your algorithm being trained enough that, if not challenged, that it will enrich the theories that we've currently got and the accepted kind of timelines that we currently got for Iznik, or indeed any other artistic development?
Yeah, I'll answer part of that, and then I want to hand it over to Melanie to give us a sense of where the gaps in Iznik are, or what we know about Iznik and what we would like to know. So you're absolutely right. We took art historians' expertise and we encoded it in what is called a supervised classification method. That is to say, we took her knowledge, and I should say the guy who, I didn't mention it, but the guy who was behind this, a guy called Yu-Chan Yang, was sort of a really clever computer scientist guy who did a master's degree with me and was just really good. So what Yu-Chang did is he took these off-the-shelf models and incorporated that knowledge that that Melanie had, in effect, and used it to, as it were, automate her knowledge. But there's a whole different way in which we could have taken this. We could have used unsupervised classification algorithms, and in that case, we don't take an art historian's knowledge and attempt to reproduce it. Rather, we just give the thing a whole bunch of tiles and artifacts or whatever, and we just say, figure it out, right? Just group it as you want. And that would be the way to find something new, right? And what could we find? Well, I don't know. I mean, we might be able to make more finer date discriminations, right? Or we could potentially even identify workshops. I know some art historians have attempted this. Do you think it can be done, Melanie? I mean, imagine we had lots more motifs, more tiles. Do you think we'd actually be able to, using unsupervised methods, find new groupings in Iznik? And what would they be?
Within the larger, if we look at the full 120-year span, let's say, divided into 3 40-year bands, already that information has been identified in terms of looking at who the designers were. But the issue here is that designers were issuing designs which were given to workshops. And it's the designer's hand that we can identify more, I think, than the individual craftsman making the tiles, making the pots. So I don't think, and I think they were anonymous and they remain anonymous. This was not a type of ceramic. There are plenty of groups of ceramics within the Islamic context in which some artisans actually do sign themselves. That's not unknown. But I think within Iznik, it really wasn't the point. The point was perhaps the leading designer from the atelier issuing the designs. And these were applied not just to ceramics, but across to metalwork, to textiles. It was a generic Ottoman style, and that changes from one generation to the next. But I don't think it will, I don't think that the AI will be able to identify the individual hand, let's speak. Or I would, even though, if you look at tiles, for instance, if you go into a specific building, such as a tomb building, which is completely lined with tiles, say one of the tombs in the Hagia Sophia complex in Istanbul. And as George and I have in fact done, we have spent time in there and we have looked at, they're identical patterns, endlessly reproduced. But if you look at each individual tile, the actual craftsmen have amused themselves by having a kind of signature, so that one puts a particular kind of spot on his tulip or something. And so going around, and if you scanned each individual tile at that stage, and these are repeat tiles of the same pattern over and over and over, but with a minute change in the way the individual craftsman paints them. So yes, if all of those were individually photographed and then individually, scanned and inputted, the data was inputted, then maybe yes, we would be able to. But that, I think, is the only circumstance under which we'd be able to achieve that result. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Madam. And thank you, Natalia. Thank you. And we have a question from our very own Maria Lee. Maria, would you mind? Okay, here she goes.
Hi, thank you so much for such a fascinating conversation. And it's also wonderful to see almost, you guys are colleagues and friends working on this together from different backgrounds. My question is about the next generation of art historians and what you think should be included in syllabus, if in fact the field is tending towards incorporating more computer science and data analysis. I mean, it's not everyone can be multi-specializing in different things. And so it's, and we all wish to have cohort and partners to do this kind of project with. What I see is a great model of interdisciplinary discussions that you guys are having. So my question then is, yeah, how do we prepare for the future for younger art historians? And seeing that you guys are all educators in your own rights, I'd love to hear from your take on this. Thank you.
Yeah, so you three take turns in answering this. I think it's for all of you. George, can you unmute yourself? Oh, okay.
I'm gonna, George, you go first.
It's a prickly question.
I have to say, Maria, it's a really good question, but it's also a difficult question to answer.
Yes, well, it was about time. Our student asks the difficult question now, isn't she? Well, it's, first of all, younger generations are incredibly tech savvy, much more than our generation was. And our familiarity with the digital image and with the things we can do with the digital image is immense. So I think we are probably by our own students. Our own students will grasp this nettle and will push it forward much quicker than we can anticipate. I think it's a done fact. However, one should try to predict, one should try to give rails, guidelines along which this thing will move. Undoubtedly, I think that the question has always been integrated art histories. It has been for the past 20 years, bringing together as much material as possible and looking across. I think the younger generation of scholars will realize that this looking across cannot be done with the tools that we have in our disposal. 100 years ago, photography was an extraordinary tool. And people would say, but you cannot look at a building through photography. There's no way you can look at a building without being there. And look at us now in the third decade of the 21st century. We do it digitally. So it's, tools that will be developed will be adopted towards an already existing question, an already existing project, which is an integrated global art history. So as far as an art historian I'm concerned, I'm not worried at all. I think the students will pick the challenge up, they will take the challenge, and they will apply all these developments very successfully towards, in the end of the day, what is, as I tried to sort of hint at the last sentence, the understanding of human creativity. and human perception. It all sounds a bit airy-fairy, but in reality, if you don't have the vision, you never go anywhere. So it's better to be a little bit, you know, open into the possibilities of this.
Let me speak for a second, and I'll give the final word to you, Armand. I think George has really pointed out how incredibly fast things have moved within an art historian's experience. In my career, I went from writing my MA thesis on a typewriter to having to absorb everything to do with computers, and right now I would say I was a bit of a dinosaur, but I jumped at the chance of getting involved with Armand because it seemed such an extraordinary idea and a fascinating idea and the way forward. And he is the leading light. I mean, he's the first scientist to be approaching it. Well, perhaps not the first, but he's one of the first to be approaching, to be taking art history. Are you the first, Armand? Maybe you are. Therefore, I think we can only move in that direction. But I would also say that art historians need to learn to look, and you need to be able to balance the ability to assess, to intellectualize, to look, and use this incredibly interesting, useful new tool to process huge amounts of information in a way that the human brain can't. So I think there are such exciting possibilities about this, and I think young students are going to be absolutely jumping on this as a way of approaching different aspects of art history.
Yeah. So by the way, there are other people interested in this, but they don't.
I've only met you.
No, I know, but they don't often have the wit to work with art historians, right? They're often just computer scientists off doing their own thing, just anyway. So when we began this project, we went to the Royal College of Art and to the master's students, and we masters of design, I think it was, yeah. And I put out a general call for people to help us with this. And I think about 8 of them expressed interest, got back to me there, and they all had a sense of that data science is in the air. They need to learn something about this, and this was the way to do it. Anyway, I sent them a very simple exercise. They had to download a data science program, a statistical program called R, and they had to do a little exercise in it. At that point, 3 of them disappeared, but 5 of them who had, and these are all art history students who have no statistical expertise, no coding expertise whatsoever. They just did it. They grappled with it. And it just took a little bit of courage and a little bit of perseverance. And they just said, yeah, we can do this. And they were delighted by it. And I think that is actually how it's going to go. I do think that not everybody has to be or can be an expert in machine learning. The cutting edge is always going to be with the specialists, right? That's always the case. But I think everybody should have at least some. Everybody should lose their fear of numbers and of coding, even if it's of the most simple variety. That's really what's needed. You just have to have a little bit of courage. And that's what I would urge our art students to learn. Yeah. It's a nice question.
Okay, and thank you for answering this question. And we have final 2 questions here. And okay, this is from our very own Candice Lee. He would like to know, well, ask you, this is dedicated to you, Armand. Why did you do this project? What was your initiative?
Well. So, well, as George said, and it's George's fault, really. I mean, as I said, boy, I didn't know what I was getting to either. I mean, remember, it was 2017. It's taken us some while. So, as George said, I'd been interested in the evolution of culture and been studying texts and music, and I'd always wanted to study some sort of art. Anyway, and I have a long fondness for Greece and actually indeed for Turkey. And it happened to be that I was in Athens and I met George, and I just found the right guy, an art historian, who would actually listen to me banging on about how art should be a science. art history should be a science, and who didn't dismiss me right away. And from that, it just naturally followed. And then it naturally followed that he had a friend, Melanie, who happened to have loved and was an expert on these things. So it was really a very personal thing, actually, more than anything else. It's all to do with Greece and Turkey and very particular people who are now great friends.
Wow, sounds like a fantastic journey, and
Yeah,
it
it
will
has
keep
been.
going down for sure. Yeah, and okay, our final question asked by Sadaf. So he's wondering, in the future, will actually art history meet like by AI, and will it replace art historians? Well, I hope not. So no.
Well, I think
Melanie,
each of us should comment.
Yeah.
Melanie, why don't you start?
Okay, well, I'll start by pointing out that the project needed art historians. The project could not operate by itself. The computer needed assistance on the colors, on all sorts of aspects at various points. Armand would be in touch and would say, okay, we need to look at this. How can we narrow it down? What do we need to look at? You know, and it couldn't happen without me and without George, in fact, I mean, who started the whole thing. So I think this has to be an alliance between science and humanities and sciences. It's not going to go in one direction with only one side. It needs both. So I think art historians will always be who develop their knowledge through looking, through reading, through thinking for themselves, but need the assistance of science in order to be able to stretch their knowledge and to use the incredible abilities of the computer in computing and statistics that alone in a lifetime I wouldn't be able to achieve. So the two just need to be allied and great results will come from it. But there's no good having one without the other.
Thank you, Melanie. And George, would you like to say something?
Well, I tried to answer this worry in my concluding remarks. I agree with Melanie. There's it's just, you know, something that takes us further. It's something that will teach us more. And as I said, remember when art history started in Germany in the late 19th century as a separate discipline, you couldn't, you know, I mean, slides were, you know, considered an abomination. The idea you would teach Renaissance art with black and white slides. And such things have changed, you know, the way we do things. And books and catalogue raisonné and all these tools that we take for granted that actually dated by now. So let's be open to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I will absolutely agree with my colleagues and friends that it's an alliance. But let me just add a little bit of a slightly jaundiced note dealing with art historians, not my dear friends George and Melanie, but art historians in general, or art history. Reading art history, as I have done over the last few years, I have to say, you know, as a scientist, I have to say sometimes, I just wonder what they're going on about, right? What I mean is this. There is so much emphasis upon that subjective, mystical connoisseurship in which, you know, you can't know anything about Greek vases unless you've handled 10,000 of them, right? Or, you know, you just have to look at the object and it's the eye and it's that mystical expertise. I have to say, as a scientist, this drives me up the wall. For me, knowledge is codified public knowledge. It is reproducible knowledge. And if it's not that, then it isn't knowledge. And I should say, sometimes when I express this, and this is a deep epistemological divide between natural sciences and art history. When I express this to some art historians, you know, they just say, yeah, no, you know, we don't need computers or statistics or anything like that to tell us, you know, we just know. And I've come across this quite a lot. So although I ardently hope for a unification between the two, I have to say, And it's that I think art history is going to have to change a little bit for that to really become the case. And I think that the way in which evidence is used and presented will have to change. And I hope it will. I think it's inevitable, actually.
Well, one thing, you know, we always make a big thing about the eye. We always talk about the feeling you get out of something, of looking at something. But in reality, this is just having at the back of your mind a huge set of images, a data set, which is so big, and you can scan through it, you can sort of go through it at such speed that you don't have to logically think about doing it, you just do it. It's a computational process. So I don't believe in the eye. I believe in a trained eye, which takes in huge amounts of data, and through some sort of computational process, as I said, scans through them and comes to a conclusion, which is again based on a process very similar to an AI machine. And let's use this machine to be able to do that in a massive scale. It's a tool.
That's exactly right.
Wow, it's really remarkable what you guys just shared with us. And as a Chinese art specialist, I can agree with George more that we ourselves, like we are just a trained AI thingy that every time when we look at an object, it's just millions of images going through us, and then we will make the right decision to see if this is this is that. Okay, so I think we get all of our questions covered. And thank you so much for such a wonderful and informative talk. It's really inspiring. And hopefully we will be visiting you soon at the Benaki Museum, George, once the pandemic is finished. And really looking forward to seeing your future publications, Armand and Melanie, and all our best. And for all who joined us today, a sincere thank you. And please keep following us for our future seminars. And until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.